Hello and welcome to the Joe Ligato Show. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Ligato, and today we're going to be talking about and analyzing this article on Russia's war in Ukraine and how it gate crashes the European Union Latin America reunion. And so they're having a get together, having a powwow, and the Europeans want to, using their colonialist mindset, want to force the Latin American countries to take on the same political position, the same foreign policy position as the European Union and Latin America, a group of countries that do have autonomy, do have agency. They're saying, absolutely not. We're not going to follow your line on Ukraine. We're not going to parrot what you tell us to say. And the funny thing is, this entire reunion, this entire interaction and engagement was meant to foster unity and promote greater cooperation. And because the European Union is talking down to Latin America, that is not actually happening. And so this article is in Politico, and it's by Camille Gidge, Sarah Arup, and Hans von der Bouchard. I don't always give the author names when I'm doing this. You could just read it yourself, but I just thought those were funny names, so I figured I'd go over them. All right. Nicaragua and Cuba oppose proposed wording on Ukraine in draft communique amid talk. They are taking orders from Moscow. So sometimes the propaganda is very subtle. It'll just like use regime instead of government or something for governments that they don't like. But other times, propaganda is right there in your face. It's completely overt. Instead of the assumption that Nicaragua and Cuba and other countries that are against being talked down to and commanded by the European Union, instead of assuming that they're just countries with agency that don't like to be treated poorly, the assumption is they are taking orders from Moscow. Just Russia, as much as I love Russia, don't get me wrong, they're not that strong on the world stage that they could just tell Nicaragua and Cuba what to do. These are countries with autonomy. They're doing very well in the current moment. And so it's really silly to sit here and pretend like they're getting orders from Moscow. So let's see what else it says. A row between European Union. Oh, this is Politico. Wait, what is this? Politico EU. Yeah. This is Politico EU because they say a row. I mean, in America, we call it like a fight or like an argument. They call it a row. Interesting, right? A row between European Union and Latin American countries over how or even whether to mention the war in Ukraine risks turning what was meant to be the celebration of a renewed partnership into a diplomatic failure. So the West right now cannot help itself. It's taking L's after L's after L's. Like, wait, is it this? Loser. They're losers. So they just can't help themselves. They have to lose on the international stage right now. They think that this is still the colonial era and they could just dictate to the rest of the world what they should be doing, what they should be thinking. And it's just not happening. And the West has not caught on to this fact yet. So they still insist on going to places like Latin America and telling them what to do. And it's absolutely hilarious to watch them just lose consistently. The first day of a summit between the European Union and the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, was all about affirming strengthened intercontinental ties, but the lofty talk quickly fell flat as EU negotiations tried to convince Latin American countries to condemn Russia over its war in Ukraine. See, that's what I don't get. This is supposed to be about cooperation, and you're coming to the table talking about, well, we're going to work with you, but only if you don't work with these other countries that we don't like. And so you're dictating to sovereign countries what they can and cannot do. So, I mean, they're pointing out Nicaragua and Cuba here, but I just really can't imagine that there are any countries that actually like to be dictated to like that. Unless they are completely controlled by the West, there's not a country that would actually like to be treated like that. There's no one, no individual or organization that would like to be treated like that. And I don't understand, too, why, if this is supposed to be about fostering increased, strengthened intercontinental ties, why you would even have to bring up Ukraine in this scenario. I mean, it's about like what you can do for them and what they can do for you. It's about like creating a symbiotic relationship, creating win-win situations, as China likes to say. And so to go there and tell the Latin American countries what to do, it's just ridiculous. So Nicaragua and Cuba vehemently opposed the proposed language on Ukraine, according to 3 EU officials. Here's where it gets hilarious, with one alleging that these two countries had received calls from Moscow advising them to do so. So, one, how do they have this information? Are they like, you just overheard a cell phone call, like Moscow's dictating what to do to them? Like, it's just, this source is ridiculous. And not only that, but in terms of journalistic ethics and integrity and just verifying sources, having one person just like give their opinion that these two countries have received calls from Moscow advising them to be against the Ukraine communication. Like, you're supposed to have multiple sources for this type of information. If you're going to throw out an accusation like this, as journalists, you should have multiple sources and you should verify that the information is somewhat accurate. I mean, it's called triangulation. You use a number of different sources, a number of different methods to figure out whether the information is accurate. But here they just have one person's opinion on, oh yeah, those Nicaraguans and Cubans, they got a phone call saying that they have to do this by Moscow. And so just hilarious how all these different media outlets are just throwing away any sort of ethics in order to propagandize you, in order to push a certain narrative. The row in Brussels came just as Russia refused Monday to extend a UN brokered deal that had allowed Ukraine to export its grain surplus through the Black Sea. So just wonderful way of putting this. So for those who are only informed by the mainstream media, and by informed by the mainstream media, I mean misinformed on the truth, this would look like an honest statement. It's not an honest statement. What happened was there was this grain deal where throughout the Black Sea, Ukrainian ships were still allowed to traverse the Black Sea in exchange for not using it to supply Ukraine with military equipment and not using it to attack the Russian homeland. And what did they do? They used the Black Sea, they used this grain deal in order to attack places in Russia, attack a bridge in Russia that killed 2 innocent civilians. So this is something I think I want to kind of touch upon as well. And that is that, yes, civilians die in wars. And I understand attacking the enemy's infrastructure. That's something that's just, it's going to happen, and civilian casualties will be collateral damage there. But there's a couple of aspects to the way Ukraine handles these things that are very concerning. One is they went back on what they said with this grain deal. They went back on making sure that the ships going in and out of the Black Sea were not used for military purposes. They went back on that. And so Russia obviously has the right to back out of this grain deal if it's being used to attack Russia. And 2, the Ukrainian and Western position on civilian deaths is becoming increasingly concerning. There's 2 people who died on the bridge. It was just, you saw nonstop cases of people mocking those 2 people who died, saying there's no civilians, they're Russians, they deserve to die. I remember reading about a Russian civilian dying from a shark attack in Egypt, and people across Ukrainian Twitter were just howling with laughter about it. Like, it just, this person wasn't even in a war zone. Like, they were just Russian. Like, it's concerning the level of racism, you want to call it ethnicism. I don't know. I just made up that term. Whatever you want to call it, it's very concerning that this is allowed to be pushed in the West. I mean, if there's something that is hate speech, it's like mocking civilians that are dying, like that, like just because of their ethnicity. Like that's actual hate speech. Like people died and you're mocking them because of their ethnicity, not because they were enemy combatants. And the thing is, I understand, I said this earlier, I understand civilians die in war. You should never glorify it. There's not going to be an instance in time, I mean, you definitely cannot clip it. There will not be an instance in time where I ever mock or glorify Ukrainian civilian deaths. That's just not how I operate. It's not how any humane person operates. And so to see not only places like Ukrainian Twitter mocking civilian deaths, but also being amplified and laughed about and memed about on Ukrainian government sources, like it's obscene. It's inhumane that this has been allowed to happen. And so just a couple of my concerns there, but notice how they talk about this. It's Russia that's the belligerent here. It's Russia that's backing out of the deal, but they don't explain why Russia backed out of the deal. The deal was Russia would allow ships to go in there as long as the ships weren't used for military purposes, as long as the ships weren't used to attack Russia. And obviously, if Ukraine does not keep to its side of the bargain, Russia is allowed to not keep to their own side of the bargain. They're allowed to back out of the deal. So the way this is worded makes it seem like Russia is the one backing out of the agreement. But in reality, if Ukraine is the one that is not holding up their side of the agreement, first, they're the ones who backed out of it, and Russia is not obligated at that point to continue enforcing the agreement. Both were stark reminders of how Russia's hybrid geopolitics seeks to drive a wedge between the rich, pro-Ukrainian West and the rest of the world. I don't know how rich the West is at this point. I had to read that twice just to understand it. The West is quickly becoming a poor place. I mean, if you've ever watched those videos, I think it's actually sad to watch, but there are places in America where you just have a person with a camera driving through the neighborhoods and it's just horrific. And a lot of people love to watch these videos. I don't know if they love them, but they do watch the videos because they have millions of views on YouTube. And it's just shocking. There are places where I grew up, places I visited that within the past 20 years have become horrifically bad in America. And so it's to call the West rich, what is it rich in? It's not rich in culture at this point. It's not rich in terms of keeping its civilians happy or wealthy enough to take care of themselves. It's a drug-addled, obese country that is miserable and suffering, and it's only able to distract itself from that miserableness and suffering through wars. And so, what is it rich in? I know I'm harping on this one word, but I really want to know. I want your thoughts in the comment section, so please let me know. Despite several rounds of negotiation on a joint declaration which leaders could sign off on, there was still no agreement on Monday evening, with some officials fearing that the two-day summit could fail to produce any joint declaration at all. Well, I mean, if you're going there to force countries to do what you say, yeah, if they have any sense of agency, they're not going to do it. I mean, you can't go into, this is what the West forgot. Really, it is what the West forgot. They forgot how to actually have an agreement with other countries that are equal. In the West colonialist mindset, there are no equals. It's one country is subservient to another country. And so in the West, when the United States makes a deal with other Western nations, the other Western nations are subservient to it. Okay? When other Western nations make a deal with non-American countries, they understand that these rest of the world countries are subservient to the West, or that's how it has traditionally been. And so for them, there is no equals. There's no win-win situations. It's just one country being subservient to another country. And for them, they don't understand this. They don't understand how to go to the table, how to have a dialogue with another country that does not involve one country lecturing or talking down to another country. So they say, I confirm that we are still discussing the text of the communique, said European Council President Charles Michel on Monday. An attempt at damage control. Well, at least they're honest about it. And it means something. It means that we want on both sides an ambitious text. I don't know. Sounds like fluff language. I mean, what are you trying to say there? I mean, I guess it's ambitious in the sense that you're trying to force countries to say something that they don't want to say. That's pretty ambitious, I guess, if you want to put it like that. An EU diplomat said at the end of the Monday's meeting that negotiations will go down to the finishing line. Haggling over the text does not put the summit into jeopardy for now. I mean, I think it certainly does put the summit in jeopardy. If these countries don't want to agree with you on a communication, they don't want to work with you on this front, I mean, and you're trying to force it on them, that's not strengthening international ties or intercontinental ties, whatever you want to call it. Credibility on the line. Let's see. Failing to agree on a joint declaration would deal a blow to the European Union's credibility at a time when it is seeking to unify voices at the United Nations and beyond in support of Ukraine against a belligerent Russia. There's so much here that's propaganda. Like, I have a doctorate in industrial and organizational psychology. And so I understand propaganda. I understand when people are trying to manipulate you, when people are trying to persuade you. A great book on persuasion is by Robert Cialdini. I'm blanking on the name. I think it's just like called like Persuade or something simple. But if you want to persuade people and manipulate them to think in a certain way, you do this. Like, look at this. Belligerent Russia. Well, I think people can agree or disagree on that. Like, I mean, why don't you just say Russia, right? I would say that Russia is acting completely rationally given the things that have occurred since the 1990s and the things that have occurred since the 2014 overthrow of the democratically elected government in Ukraine. And so, like, calling them the belligerents is nothing but propaganda. It's like I was saying earlier about calling a government a regime. It's like some things have negative connotations, and this is so blatantly negative, belligerent, that it's just propaganda. It's completely propaganda. And you see it nonstop throughout these articles, just trying to convince you to believe a certain narrative by the end of the article. It's not factually based. I mean, calling it belligerent, people would obviously disagree with that. So why even use that type of language there, right? It's just to persuade you of a certain viewpoint. Journalists are not trying to objectively convey information to you anymore. They're activists. That's what they are now. Journalists are not journalists, they're activists. They're trying to manipulate you to agree with them. Failing to agree on a joint declaration. Yeah, credibility, belligerent Russia. I mean, what credibility does the European Union have left at this point, given how poorly things have gone, given the European Union's current stance? I mean, it used to be the case that the European Union was slightly bigger than the United States in the early 2000s. And now the United States is far bigger than the European Union. The European Union, the EU, has not grown since the 2008 financial crisis, 2007-2008 financial crisis. And so what credibility does the European Union have when it's a stagnant group that's dying off, that other countries just laugh at this point because the European Union is not successful, and countries that join the European Union are not successful either? You see various countries in the Balkan region that become more Western-oriented, not necessarily a part of the EU, but more Western-oriented and joining the Western system, and they're worse off. They're in more debt. I mean, I was watching videos, commenter recommended Weight of Chains 1, 2, and 3 on the Yugoslavian situation. And those countries that broke up from the former Yugoslavia, they're all worse off. This is something I talk about quite often. I know this video is going a little bit long, but it's just so interesting. I would love for someone to point to an example of a country in the modern world, I would say post-World War II, that has been better off since becoming subservient to the United States. When you look at places like Germany and Japan, Japan is wildly in debt. It's been stagnant for decades. It was forced into the Plaza Accords, which destroyed its industries and destroyed its growth. Then you look at Germany, and their energy infrastructure was likely bombed by the United States. That's my suspicion. That's other people like Seymour Hersh's suspicion. And their economy is starting to deindustrialize. Various segments of the economy are just leaving for other greener pastures like China. Then you have places like South Korea, which, sure, South Korea is somewhat successful right now. They went from a very poor country to a very rich country, but they're also subservient to the United States. They're not allowed to push United States bases out of their country. They're not allowed to even being in control of their military. They've been trying for years now to have the ultimate authority of their military, but the United States still has ultimate authority over the South Korean military. Their birth rate is plummeting. They're completely westernized, and it's not done the mental health of South Koreans any good. They're miserable. Their country is just, I mean, it's pretty much controlled by mega corporations such as Samsung at this point. And so, like, I really can't point to examples of countries that have actually thrived being completely subservient to the United States. And obviously, Ukraine's another one of those examples where it became poorer after the 2014 coup against the democratically elected government. It became poorer, and it really became a worse country in general across a variety of different metrics. It's just a sad, sad place to live in. And so I'm trying to scratch my head about what countries have actually been successful after becoming subservient to the United States. Poland is another one of those examples where on paper, maybe it has, but then that's because of the fact that other countries, specifically European Union countries, are just throwing money at Poland in order to prop it up. And so there's really not a country I could think of that has actually benefited from the United States and from the European Union at this point. But back to the article. Brussels is also trying to become best buddies with Latin America again in the face of an assertive China that is winning market share on the other side of the Atlantic. I mean, in order to see another few things to mention here. One, assertive China. Oh, you mean China's just trying to make win-win deals with other countries where they build infrastructure projects and get some natural resources in return? Like that's the assertive China. Like they're minding their own business, not trying to bother you at all, and you're calling them assertive China. It's just ridiculous. It's propaganda. And to talk about outcompeting China, what does the European Union have to offer these other countries? European Union, their industrial base is declining, so they can't offer them tangible goods. All they could do is offer Latin American countries lectures about how they should act, what is supposedly moral, what is supposedly humane, just complain about Latin American countries. That's all the European Union can offer right now. And you're seeing the results of that. You're seeing that these countries don't actually like the European Union anymore, and they don't like the West, and they're not going to take it. They're not going to listen to these scoldings that are given to them. So here's another one of those ridiculous quotes. If Russia were to lay down its arms, there would be peace. If Ukraine were to lay down its arms, there would be no more Ukraine. Just a ridiculous statement by the Latvian Prime Minister, Krišjānis Kariņš. Oh, this is an actual Karen. So yeah, the Karen, whose country borders Russia. So a ridiculous statement because of the fact that Russia was trying to join the West for the longest time, and they were rebuffed. They were harassed. I was actually just reading about, and I'm probably going to make a video on this eventually, how various, I think it was Tony Blair that I was reading about, how they were trying to foment tension along the Russian border in order to make Russia wary, cautious, confused. And it's like, and this was back in the early 2000s when Russia was like, oh, please can I join NATO? Please can I join the European Union, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, this country that is trying to be more westernized, you're just bullying it. You're just outright bullying it. So saying that there would be peace if Russia laid down its arms is just ridiculous. There would only be peace after the West fractured, broke up Russia, and then was able to steal all of its resources. We saw that happen after the collapse of the Soviet Union in places like Russia and in places like Ukraine. Really hilarious. I was reading another article about how they were saying Putin reversed all the democratic progress in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union when he took power. And it's like, well, wait a minute. No, that time between the collapse of the Soviet Union and when he took power, Russians were doing terribly. Like, that was a horrific time for Russia. So saying that he reversed democratic progress when he's so popular as a leader, it's complete propaganda. Complete propaganda. Maybe from a distant area, it's not so obvious to understand. So just talking down to Caribbean and Latin American countries again. Okay. Latest versions of the document that they're trying to get signed, seen by Politico, dated between July 7th and July 13th, showed that the language on Ukraine has been watered down, going from strongly condemning Moscow's violating Ukraine's sovereignty to just expressing concern on the war in Ukraine. Okay, completely fine to express concern. Asked about the holdup, Honduran Foreign Minister Enrique Reina said, I believe that it is part of this process to find in this dialogue a way out that respects the visions of both the European Union and CELAC and each of its members. So Honduras, another country that's not completely fond of the European Union's language. Ukraine was not the only contentious issue, with the draft communique resembling a shopping list after each capital pushed to mention their national priorities, such as colonial reparations or the Malvinas Islands. Oh, that's an Argentinian thing, over which Argentina and the UK, which is no longer an EU member, fought a short war 40 years ago. So just funny how this tends to work out, where the European Union only wants to enforce its own priorities, but when these other countries come to the European Union with their own priorities, like, hey, you kind of screwed us over with colonialism, the European Union is just kind of like, la 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 la, I don't want to hear it. And so just interesting. This entire article was very interesting. So if you enjoyed hearing my breakdown of the propaganda, I know this was a very long video, but if you enjoyed hearing it, if you stuck with me this entire time, thank you. And please give a like to this video. It helps me in the algorithm. And subscribe to our channel for more content. I love making this content. I would love to make more of this content. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, please put that in the comment box. I always read them. And so I love reading them. I get ideas for other future videos from that as well. And yeah, thank you for sticking with me, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.